On a quiet afternoon, an old barn creaks in the wind as a loyal dog scratches furiously at its worn wooden floor. At first, it seems like nothing, just a restless animal. But then the sound changes, hollow and eerie, as if hiding something beneath. What the veteran who owns this barn discovers will not only reveal a secret buried for decades, but will also stir memories of war, survival, and friendship that refuse to fade. Stay with me, because this story will lead you down a path no one expected, into a hidden world where the past still breathes. The late afternoon sun stretched its golden arms across the rolling fields, bathing everything in a calm, forgiving light that seemed to soften even the sharpest memories of a hard-lived life. The barn had stood for decades on that land, its wooden boards faded grey from years of wind and rain, its beams still stubbornly upright despite storms that had tested its bones. For most, it was just an old storage place, useful for tools, hay, and a few forgotten relics of farm work long gone. But for James Whitaker, a veteran of wars few still spoke about, it was something more. It was a place where he could be alone with his thoughts, where the quiet creak of wood and smell of earth mixed into a kind of peace that few men ever found after battle. James was in his late 70s, tall though his back had begun to bend from years of toil. His frame was wiry, his skin lined deeply by sun and sorrow, his short white beard trimmed neatly as if discipline never truly left him. A faint scar ran across his left cheek, a reminder of days when survival was more luck than choice. He wore the same thing he wore most days, faded denim overalls and a red and black checkered flannel shirt, brown boots that had seen as many seasons as he had, and on his wrist a leather strap watch that had once belonged to his father. At his side trotted Duke, his German shepherd. Duke was 8 now, not quite a pup anymore, but strong, loyal, and watchful. His tan and black coat shone in the light, though grey flecks had begun to show around his muzzle. His golden brown eyes were alert, always scanning the fields and barn as if no moment should go unguarded. That afternoon, James carried a bucket of tools toward the barn, the sound of metal clinking softly with each step. He planned nothing extraordinary, just another day fixing a hinge, maybe tightening a loose beam before autumn winds grew strong. Life, after all, had become a pattern of quiet maintenance, both of wood and of spirit. He walked slowly, his hand brushing the tall grass as Duke weaved in and out at his side, the dog's tail wagging at some invisible rhythm of joy. The barn door groaned when James pulled it open, the sound echoing like an old friend clearing his throat. Dust swirled lazily in the sunlight as he stepped inside, setting the bucket down with a heavy thud on the wooden floor. The air smelled of old hay and oil, of wood that had absorbed stories through the years. James paused, letting his hand rest on the frame of the barn, feeling its familiar texture, the grooves of weather and time. For him, places like this weren't just wooden nails. They were witnesses, holding memories in silence, waiting for the right moment to speak again. Duke padded in behind him, nose twitching, tail relaxed, yet ready. The dog moved with that unspoken bond of animals who know their place in a man's life. Not just a companion, but a guardian, a friend who sees what others cannot. James lowered himself onto a worn, wooden chair, pulling out an old rag to wipe the sweat from his brow. He reached for a wrench from the bucket, his hands steady despite the years, and began the small work he'd come to do. It was just another afternoon, another repetition in the quiet cycle of his later life. Yet, somewhere deep beneath the creaking boards, beneath the weight of history and time, something waited. Something neither man nor dog yet understood. Something that would soon break the silence of the barn, shatter the ordinary rhythm of days, and pull James Whitaker back into a story he thought had ended long ago. Inside the barn, the light shifted as the sun moved lower, golden beams slipping through the gaps between old boards and spilling across the dusty floor like thin ribbons of fire. James settled himself onto his worn wooden chair, the kind that had served him faithfully for decades, each creak of its legs as familiar as the sound of his own heartbeat. He pulled a small tool from the bucket, a hammer with its handle polished smooth from years of use, and placed it across his lap. His eyes wandered over the space around him, the shelves lined with jars of nails, coils of rope, oil-stained rags. These were the ordinary things that made his world steady, predictable, even comforting. In the quiet, the barn spoke in whispers. A low groan from the beams, the faint rustle of hay, the distant call of a bird outside. James had lived long enough to know that silence was never truly silent. It carried echoes, memories, and sometimes even warnings. He exhaled slowly, feeling a calmness he had not always known in life. For a man who had faced artillery fire, long marches, and sleepless nights under foreign skies, these simple sounds were precious. But as his mind drifted toward memory, Duke stirred. The German shepherd had been lying comfortably at James's feet, his head resting on his front paws, his body relaxed. Yet now his ears flicked back, and his eyes opened wide, scanning the floorboards with sudden intensity. A low rumble grew in his throat, not a bark, but a sound of alertness, of unease. James looked down at him, brow furrowing. "What is it, boy?" His voice, gravelly with age, filled the still barn. Duke rose to his feet, body tense, tail stiff. He sniffed at the air, then pressed his nose against a spot on the floor not far from James's boots. The boards there looked no different than the rest, worn, dusty, marked by years of boots and hooves. But the dog's focus was unshakable. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his scar catching the glow of the sunlight. He studied Duke's posture, the rigid way his shoulders stood, the determined gleam in those golden brown eyes. In war, James had learned to trust instinct, his own, and that of the men beside him. And here, now, he felt the same truth. The dog's instinct was telling him something he could not yet see or hear. Still, he hesitated. This barn was part of his daily rhythm, every nail and knot in the wood familiar. He had never once thought of it as a place of secrets. And yet, he could not shake the ripple of unease creeping into his chest as Duke's claws scratched lightly against the floorboards. James shifted in his chair, running his rough hand over his beard. He remembered nights on patrol when silence felt wrong, when the air carried something hidden, waiting. The barn suddenly felt like that, peaceful on the surface, yet holding something just beneath. "Easy now, Duke," he muttered, though his own voice carried no certainty. Duke didn't move. The dog's breathing deepened, his paws now pressing firmly against the floor as if marking the spot. His tail gave a single twitch, the kind of movement that said he was ready to act, ready to dig, ready to uncover whatever lay below. James felt a chill despite the warmth of the day. His hands, once steady with tools and weapons alike, now trembled slightly on his knees. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the floor where Duke stood guard. The light from the barn's slats fell directly across that patch of wood, illuminating it as though nature itself had chosen to spotlight the secret. For the first time in years, James felt that old, familiar edge, the sense that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. He thought he knew about this quiet place. The barn, quiet only moments before, now seemed alive with sound. Duke, the German shepherd who had spent years at James's side, suddenly lunged forward toward the patch of floor that had captured his attention. His claws struck the wood in rapid succession, sharp scrapes echoing through the barn as though he were tearing into something that should not be disturbed. Dust leapt into the air, sparkling in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the cracks in the wall. James rose from his chair more quickly than a man of his age should, his knees stiff, but his mind sharpened by the urgency of his dog's movements. The hammer slipped from his lap and clattered against the floor, but he paid it no mind. His eyes stayed locked on Duke, who scratched with a determination that spoke of instinct deeper than reason. "Easy, Duke. What's gotten into you, boy?" James's voice was low, stern, but beneath it trembled a note of unease. Duke didn't pause. His muscles rippled beneath his tan and black coat, his tail stiff with intensity. Each strike of his paw chipped away at the worn planks, sending splinters scattering. The sound was steady, hollow, unnatural. James froze at that hollow tone. He had walked this floor for decades, carrying hay, tools, and memories across it, and never once had he thought the wood sounded like that. Hollow meant empty. Hollow meant something beneath. His scarred cheek twitched as his jaw tightened, the soldier in him awakening from its long slumber. Slowly, James stepped closer, boots crunching against wood dust. The barn's beams groaned, as if they too were straining to hear what Duke had uncovered. He squatted down beside the dog, his wiry frame bending carefully, his weathered hand brushing away loose debris as Duke paused, panting heavily, tongue lolling, but eyes fixed on the same spot. James laid his palm flat against the floorboards. The wood felt cool, too cool for a structure so long bathed in sun. He tapped it lightly with his knuckles, and there it was again. That hollow echo, deep and strange, not the solid resistance he had known his whole life. His breath caught in his chest. He remembered nights during his service when the ground beneath his feet had hidden more than dirt. Tunnels carved by desperate hands, pathways of escape or ambush. Memories pressed against him, sharp and unwelcome, but undeniable. Duke let out a low growl, deep in his throat, protective yet insistent. James looked at his companion, meeting those golden brown eyes. "You found something, didn't you?" he whispered, though the words were more to himself than to the dog. His fingers traced the faint cracks between planks, noticing how the edges seemed different here, less worn, less natural, almost as if they had been placed with intention. The air felt thicker, heavier, as though the barn itself was holding its breath. James sat back on his heels, the weight of discovery pressing down on him. For years, the barn had been a refuge, a place of routine and safety. But now, with the floor beneath him singing a hollow song and his loyal dog digging with unshakable purpose, he sensed the shift. The ordinary had cracked, and through that crack was something extraordinary waiting to be revealed. Duke barked once, sharp and commanding, as if to push James forward. The sound jolted the old man from his haze. He reached for the crowbar leaning against the wall, his hand trembling as it wrapped around the cold iron handle. He stood there for a moment, crowbar in hand, staring at the floor where sunlight and dust mingled, where his dog had clawed at the veil of secrecy. James exhaled deeply, a soldier's breath before battle, and whispered, "All right, old boy, let's see what we've got here." James knelt slowly, joints creaking in protest, but his mind sharper now than it had been in years. Duke stood close, his tail stiff, ears pointed, his growl low and steady, vibrating like a warning drum in the silence of the barn. The patch of wood before them carried no sign of rot or damage, just ordinary boards weathered by decades of life. And yet, when James pressed his palm against them, the strange coolness returned. He leaned closer, his face lined with focus, the scar across his cheek glowing faintly in the sunlight filtering through the slats above. Dust tickled his nose, but he ignored it, sweeping his calloused hand over the cracks where Duke had scratched. His fingertips found something, edges too straight, seams too deliberate. These weren't the random imperfections of wood worn by time. These were lines made by intention, by hands that had once wanted to conceal, not reveal. He paused, letting that truth sink in. His chest tightened with a mixture of fear and memory. For a man who had walked through foreign ruins and unearthed hidden caches in war-torn villages, this moment felt eerily familiar. The barn he thought he knew, the barn that had been his sanctuary, was holding a secret all its own. James drew back, resting on one knee. His breath was uneven, and for a brief moment he closed his eyes. Faces from long ago flashed in his mind. Friends lost, nights huddled underground with nothing but whispers and prayer. The air in the barn grew heavier, the silence almost expectant. Duke whined softly, nudging James's arm with his nose, urging him forward. Opening his eyes, James gave a small nod, as if acknowledging both the dog and the weight of what lay ahead. He reached down again, this time with deliberate care, brushing away more dust until the faint outline of a square became clear, carved into the planks as though someone had once intended this section to be lifted. His heart pounded harder than it had in years. He tapped it once more with his knuckles, and the hollow reply rang out, undeniable. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, his voice low, almost reverent. He sat back on his heels, studying the discovery. This was no accident of construction, no quirk of old wood. Someone, sometime long ago, had built this. And for what? Storage? Escape? Protection? The questions surged in his mind, each one heavier than the last. Duke growled again, pawing at the edge as if impatient with his master's hesitation. James managed a thin smile, though his eyes remained shadowed by worry. "You're right, boy. No turning back now." He straightened his back, wincing as the motion tugged at stiff muscles. With deliberate care, he placed both hands on the crowbar he had fetched earlier. The cold iron felt steady in his grip, familiar in a way that tools and weapons often are to men who have spent their lives with them. He wedged its tip into the seam between the boards, his scarred face tightening with effort as he pressed. Down. The wood resisted at first, groaning in defiance, then gave a sudden creak as if exhaling after years of holding its breath. James froze, listening. The sound of the barn changed, subtle but real, as though the very walls had acknowledged the awakening of something buried. Dust rained softly down from the beams above, stirred by the shifting air. Duke's eyes never left the boards, his body tense with anticipation. For a moment, James allowed himself to simply stare at what he was uncovering. Fear and curiosity wrestled inside him, two old rivals he had known all his life. And in that stillness, he realized something he had long forgotten. Even at 77, the world could still surprise him. He exhaled, the breath heavy with resolve, and whispered into the dust-filled air, "Let's see what's been waiting down there all these years." James adjusted his grip on the crowbar, his knuckles white and stiff with age, though the strength in his arms had not entirely left him. Duke stood close, body angled forward, eyes locked on the floor, as if he understood that something extraordinary lay beneath. The silence of the barn was broken only by the distant call of crows outside, and the occasional groan of old timber, a song of age that now blended with the sound of iron prying against wood. With a deep grunt, James pressed harder. The boards resisted, then gave way with a sharp crack, the sound echoing like a rifle shot through the hollow space below. Dust billowed upward, filling the air with a musty scent that carried with it the weight of years, of secrets long sealed away. James coughed, waving his hand before his face, his scar catching the light in a sharp line. He worked slowly, methodically, forcing one board up, then another, sweat gathering at his temples despite the coolness of the barn's interior. His breath grew heavier, but determination carried him. He had lived through worse than this, through nights of fear in foreign lands, through wounds that should have ended him, through loneliness that gnawed at him for decades. If there was something hidden here, he would see it through. As the third plank came loose, Duke stepped forward, nose twitching furiously, growl low and uncertain. The hollow beneath revealed itself more fully now. Not just empty space, but an opening, dark and waiting. James leaned closer, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. His heart pounded against his chest, as if reminding him that he was still alive, still capable of discovery, still tethered to mystery. The crowbar slipped from his hand and clattered against the floor, the noise startling Duke, who barked once in sharp reply before falling silent again. "Easy, boy," James muttered, though his own voice shook. He lowered himself carefully onto his knees, peering into the space. At first, there was only darkness, a thick blackness that seemed almost alive, swallowing the daylight. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw the faint edges of wood cut with purpose. This wasn't nature. This was craft. Someone, long ago, had built a way down. James sat back, pulling in a long breath. The weight of what he was seeing pressed on him in ways he hadn't expected. Memories of tunnels from war flickered in his mind. The smell of damp earth, the constant threat that something deadly might wait at the other end. He felt the old instinct stir within him, the need to be careful, deliberate, prepared. He glanced at Duke, who stood firm, ears high, body tense but ready. That dog had never failed him. James reached out, resting a rough hand on Duke's back, grounding himself in the solid warmth of his companion. "Looks like we found ourselves a secret," he whispered. His eyes returned to the gap, widening it with steady hands until the outline of a square opening appeared. The ladder came into view, its wooden rungs worn but still intact, descending into the unknown. The sight made his pulse quicken, the years between soldier and farmer collapsing in an instant. He could almost hear the voices of men he once knew, calling out in hushed tones, urging him forward. He shut his eyes briefly, letting the memories pass like a tide before opening them again, fixed on the present. He wasn't in a foreign land. He was here, at home, in his barn, with his dog, facing a secret someone had thought important enough to bury. He leaned back, exhaling a heavy breath, and muttered to the dust and sunlight, "Whoever left this here, they wanted it hidden. But Duke, I reckon it's ours to uncover now." The air inside the barn had shifted. It no longer carried only the familiar scent of dust and hay, but something older, something damp and earthen that drifted upward from the opening in the floor. James knelt by the hole, his knees pressing into the rough boards, his eyes locked on the dark space below. His breath came slow and steady, though inside his chest his heart hammered with a force that reminded him of days when danger had lurked behind every corner. Duke stood beside him, silent now, nose twitching, as he sniffed the cool draft that rose from the tunnel. The German shepherd tilted his head, ears sharp, body leaning forward as if ready to leap, but his eyes flicked back toward James, waiting for a signal. James reached for the flashlight hanging on a nail by the wall. Its metal casing was worn and dented, a tool as old as some of his memories. He thumbed the switch, and the beam of light cut through the shadows like a blade, chasing dust motes down into the opening. What it revealed made him sit back on his heels. There, just below the jagged edges of the broken boards, a ladder descended into the earth. The wood of its rungs was darkened with age but still solid, built with care. The beam of light followed it downward, revealing rough earthen walls shored up by planks. The kind of reinforcement meant not for show, but for survival. A tunnel. A real tunnel, carved out and hidden beneath his barn all these years. James swallowed hard. His mind reeled with questions. Who had built it? When? Why here? Of all places. He had lived in this place for decades, walked across this floor more times than he could count, and yet the secret had remained. His scar ached faintly, as it sometimes did when old wounds remembered the past. He felt, for a fleeting moment, as though he had been transported back to another life, when tunnels meant danger, when every dark passage might hide an enemy or a friend clinging to hope. Duke let out a low whine, the sound of a companion sensing unease. James reached out, resting a hand on the dog's sturdy back. "Steady, boy," he murmured. His voice was calm, but his eyes stayed on the ladder. He leaned closer to the opening, the flashlight's beam gliding down until it was swallowed by blackness. The tunnel stretched further than he could see. He shifted his weight, lowering himself onto the floor, legs dangling over the edge. The boards groaned beneath him, but his grip on the ladder was steady. His boots touched the first rung, the wood creaking softly, yet holding strong. He tested it with his weight, nodding to himself. Still sound. Duke barked once, sharp and urgent, as if questioning this choice. James managed a faint smile. "Don't worry, I'm not going far. Not yet." He climbed down one rung, then another, his body tense but purposeful. The cool air brushed against his face, carrying with it the smell of soil, long undisturbed. For every step he descended, the sunlight above grew fainter, replaced by the pale circle of his flashlight beam. Duke remained at the top, head lowered into the opening, ears pricked forward, loyal eyes following every movement. James paused halfway down, lifting the flashlight to sweep it around. The walls were close, rough earth packed tight, reinforced with planks in careful intervals. Whoever built this hadn't done so in haste. This was crafted to endure. He tightened his grip on the rung, his scar catching the glow of the light. He knew what this meant. The tunnel wasn't just a hiding place. It was a statement, a purpose buried deep. He climbed back up to the surface, boots finding the boards again, breath heavy but mind racing. Duke nudged him with his nose, tail wagging slightly though his body still tense. James rested a hand on the dog's head and whispered, more to himself than to the animal, "There's a story buried down there, Duke, and I reckon it's time we find out what it is." James stood at the edge of the opening longer than he intended, the flashlight beam dancing over the wooden ladder and the earthen walls that descended into silence. Duke paced at his side, nails clicking lightly on the barn floor, a low whine rising in his throat every so often. The dog's body was taut, caught between the instinct to protect and the fear of letting his master slip into the unknown. James reached down and rubbed behind Duke's ear, the way he always did when he needed the dog to steady. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his gravelly voice soft yet firm. "I've faced darker holes than this." The words were meant to reassure, but they carried truth. Memories stirred like dust in the corners of James's mind. Memories of foreign tunnels, of sliding down into darkness with only a trembling lantern and the weight of trust on his shoulders. He had walked those paths, not knowing if they led to comrades in hiding or enemies waiting in silence. Now, here in his own barn, those years came rushing back. He wasn't young anymore. His bones ached, his back bowed, but the old soldier's instincts had never left him. He tested the ladder again, pressing his boot firmly against the first rung. It groaned, but it held. Slowly, carefully, he swung one leg over, then the other, gripping the sides with hands still strong despite the tremor of age. Duke barked once, sharp and commanding, as though to call him back. James looked up, scar catching the sunlight, and gave the dog a firm nod. "Stay sharp up here. I won't be long." Step by step, he descended. The wood was rough beneath his palms, cold against his skin. Each rung creaked under his weight, but none gave way. The beam of his flashlight cut downward, illuminating the narrow shaft. The earthen walls closed in around him, and the smell of damp soil grew stronger, mingling with the faint scent of old wood. He felt it against his face, cool and heavy, carrying secrets that had been buried for years. Halfway down, he paused, his breath slow and controlled. The silence here was thick, broken only by the faint scrape of his boots and the distant sound of Duke pacing above. He raised the flashlight, sweeping its glow in a circle. The wooden supports were sturdy, placed with care. Whoever dug this tunnel hadn't been desperate or careless. They had meant for it to last. James muttered to himself, "This wasn't built in a day." Finally, his boots touched solid ground. He steadied himself, straightening slowly, the beam of his light stretching into the dark corridor that opened before him. His heart pounded, not from exertion, but from anticipation. The tunnel stretched further than he could see, the walls closing in, the ceiling low. It felt like stepping back through time, into a chapter of his life he thought had ended long ago. He turned his head upward. Above, Duke's face appeared in the square of sunlight, ears pointed, eyes burning with worry and loyalty. The dog whined softly, tail flicking, unwilling to leave his master's sight. James raised the flashlight, tilting it toward Duke. "Good boy, keep watch. If I don't come back quick, you'll know." For a long moment, he stood still, letting the past and present wash over him. The weight of years pressed on his scarred face. But so too did the determination that had carried him through battles no man should have survived. He wasn't just an old farmer anymore. He was a soldier again, standing at the mouth of mystery, preparing to uncover what had been hidden beneath his very home. Taking a deep breath, James stepped forward into the tunnel. The sound of his boots echoed faintly against the dirt walls, a lonely rhythm in the silence of the underground. Behind him, the barn above stood quiet, sunlight pouring in, Duke watching every movement. The descent was complete. The journey had just begun. The air grew colder as James's boots pressed into the packed earth of the tunnel floor. He stood there a moment, letting the flashlight beam sweep across the darkness, his lungs filling with the smell of damp soil mixed with the faint, acrid scent of old wood. The silence was complete, the kind of silence that made every breath and every shuffle of his boots echo louder than it should. Behind him, Duke's anxious whine drifted faintly from above, reminding James that he wasn't entirely alone. But down here, in this hidden place, it felt as though time itself had stopped. The tunnel stretched forward, its walls supported by planks nailed with precision. James ran his hand along one of the beams, feeling its rough grain beneath his fingers. It was sturdy, too sturdy to be a makeshift effort. Whoever had built this had known what they were doing. Soldiers, perhaps, or farmers with secrets too heavy to leave on the surface. He swallowed, the taste of memory thick in his throat. This wasn't the first time he had walked underground passages, but it was the first time he had found one beneath his own barn. He moved carefully, one step at a time, flashlight guiding the way. The beam revealed details carved into the earthen walls, grooves where tools had bitten into the dirt, places where boards had been reinforced more than once, and then, just ahead, the tunnel widened into a chamber. James's breath caught. It wasn't large, no bigger than a small shed, but it was enough to feel like a hidden room carved beneath the world. At the center of the chamber sat a wooden trunk, its lid coated in decades of dust, its iron hinges streaked with rust, but intact. Around it, a scattering of forgotten relics lay where they had fallen. A dented helmet, a canvas satchel, the skeletal remains of a lantern. The flashlight beam lingered on each object, and James felt his pulse quicken. His scar itched faintly on his cheek, as it always did when the past pressed too close. He stepped closer, boots crunching softly on the dirt. The trunk loomed larger, its presence commanding, as though it carried more than just objects. It carried stories, memories, perhaps even confessions buried by men long gone. James knelt, his knees pressing into the cold earth, his hand trembling as he brushed a layer of dust from the lid. The surface revealed faint etchings, almost invisible at first, but under the flashlight's glow they became clearer. Initials carved by a steady hand, long ago. His breath caught. He recognized the letters. For a long moment, James could do nothing but stare. He reached out, his fingers grazing the old wood, the weight of memory pressing on his chest. He had seen those initials before, on dog tags, on letters passed between comrades, on the fading photographs of men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him. The years collapsed in an instant, and he felt as though he were back there, a young man with dirt on his face and hope clutched, tight in his heart. The chamber seemed to close in around him, filled not with silence, but with echoes of the past. He could almost hear voices, laughter shared over rations, whispered prayers in the dark, cries of warning when danger pressed too near. He blinked hard, forcing the memories back into the corners of his mind. This wasn't the battlefield. This was his barn. And yet, somehow, the two worlds had collided here, beneath his feet. He sat back on his heels, gripping the flashlight tighter. His voice, though low, sounded firm in the silence. "You left this for me to find, didn't you?" Of course, no answer came. Only the soft whisper of air drifting through the tunnel, as if the earth itself had sighed. James drew in a steady breath, his resolve hardening. He knew what he had to do next. The trunk was waiting, and whatever it carried, it was a story he could no longer turn away from. James knelt in the chill of the underground chamber, the beam of his flashlight fixed on the trunk that sat like a sentinel in the dirt. Its surface was scarred and coated with decades of dust, but the weight it carried was unmistakable. Duke had finally worked up the courage to climb down the ladder, his claws clicking against the wood until his paws sank into the cool soil. The dog shook himself once, then pressed close to James's side, sniffing at the trunk with cautious interest. His tail wagged faintly, but his ears remained pinned forward, alert and uncertain. James reached out with a trembling hand, brushing more dust from the lid. The initials carved into the wood stared back at him like ghosts from another life. He swallowed hard, memories flashing through his mind. Faces of young men, laughter shared over tin cups, whispered conversations before dawn patrols. Some of those men had never made it home. And now, here in the earth beneath his barn, something tied to them had been waiting all these years. The hinges groaned as he pressed against the trunk. At first, the lid resisted, sealed by time and neglect. He pressed harder, his wiry arms straining, until finally the iron creaked and gave way. A gust of stale air rose as the lid lifted, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of age, of paper long stored, of leather stiffened by years, of metal dulled by dust. James hesitated, then angled the flashlight into the open chest. Inside lay a collection of objects carefully arranged, as if their owner had known they would matter someday. Folded letters bound with a fraying ribbon. A bundle of photographs curled at the edges. A worn military jacket, the fabric faded but still bearing patches of pride. And at the very bottom, tucked into a corner, the glint of medals dulled by years of silence. James's breath caught in his throat. He reached in with reverence, fingers trembling as he lifted the top bundle. The letters crackled softly in his hands, their envelopes yellowed and fragile. He traced the handwriting on one, familiar, steady, the script of a man he once called brother. His vision blurred as tears welled, unbidden, spilling down his scarred cheek. He hadn't cried like this in years, not since the day he buried his wife. But here, surrounded by earth and memory, the past demanded release. Duke pressed his head against James's arm, whining softly, sensing the flood of emotions that words could never carry. James stroked the dog's fur absently, his voice breaking as he whispered, "You kept this here? All this time? Why?" His question hung heavy in the chamber, unanswered but not empty. The silence seemed to thrum with presence, as though the men whose lives were captured in those letters still lingered in the shadows, watching, waiting. He set the letters aside gently and lifted one of the photographs. The image was faded, but the outlines remained clear. A group of soldiers gathered around a makeshift table. Smiles stretched across their weary faces. There he was, younger, stronger, a world of life ahead of him. And beside him, the very man whose initials marked the trunk. James traced the faces with a shaking finger, each one a reminder of bonds forged in fire and tested by loss. His chest tightened as he placed the photograph back. He leaned heavily on one knee, staring at the trunk's contents, the weight of discovery pressing on him with both sorrow and gratitude. These were not just relics. They were fragments of lives lived, sacrifices made, promises left unspoken. James exhaled slowly, his voice rough but steady. You didn't want the world to forget. You wanted someone to remember. And somehow, that someone is me. He reached for another letter, knowing he could not stop now. Whatever lay within these pages, whatever story was preserved in this hidden place, it was meant to be found, and he would honor it, even if it broke his heart. The beam of the flashlight trembled slightly in James's hand as he leaned closer to the open trunk. Dust swirled gently in the air, disturbed by his every breath, as though the earth itself was exhaling secrets long kept. Duke sat faithfully at his side, his golden brown eyes fixed on his master, his warm body pressing against James's leg for comfort. For the first time in many years, James felt small, not because of weakness, but because of the weight of memory pressing down upon him. He reached into the trunk and lifted the bundle of letters, bound with a faded ribbon. His fingers, rough and calloused, traced the fragile paper. The envelopes were thin, brittle from age, yet the ink of the handwriting remained legible. Carefully, he slid one open. The words spilled across the page in steady lines, written by a soldier to his family, filled with longing and hope. James's lips moved silently as he read, the letters forming sentences that pulled him back in time. We fight hard, but we dream of coming home. The thought of family is what keeps us alive. He stopped, swallowing hard. His vision blurred with tears, and he blinked to clear them, though the words refused to steady. He remembered the man who had written these lines, a boy, really, barely 20, with a laugh that could cut through even the darkest night. That boy had not made it home. His sacrifice had been buried, just as these letters had been hidden, left to wait for someone who would care enough to read them. James pressed the letter to his chest, closing his eyes. His scar throbbed faintly, as though his body remembered the wound of loss as much as his heart did. Duke nudged his arm gently, whining with a sound that was soft, sympathetic. James smiled faintly through the sorrow, lowering his hand to stroke the dog's fur. "You're right, boy," he murmured. "He deserves to be remembered. All of them do." Next, he lifted one of the medals from the bottom of the trunk. Its ribbon was frayed, its metal dulled, but the design was unmistakable, a token of bravery, of service, of sacrifice. James turned it slowly in the beam of his flashlight, watching it glint faintly before the shadows swallowed it again. His throat tightened. He had medals of his own tucked away in drawers upstairs, but seeing this one, untouched for decades, carried a different weight. It wasn't just recognition. It was a story, a life, preserved in metal and cloth. Beneath the medals lay photographs, edges curled and blackened with time. James lifted them one by one. Faces stared back at him, young, hopeful, full of energy. In one, a group of men lounged together, their boots caked in mud, grinning as though the war outside had paused just long enough for a joke. In another, a single man stood tall, chin lifted with pride, his uniform neat despite the hardship around him. James's own younger face appeared in one photo, alongside friends he hadn't seen in half a century. He traced the image with his finger, his heart aching with the recognition of who had been lost and who had endured. Tears rolled down his weathered cheeks, unchecked, soaking into his beard. He did not try to stop them. The barn above, the fields outside, the life he had built in peace. All of it seemed to blur against the clarity of what lay here before him. The raw reminder that he was part of something larger, something filled with sacrifice, love, and memory. James placed the items back into the trunk with care, as though they were sacred relics. His voice broke the silence, rough yet tender. "You wanted these stories to live on. You didn't want the world to forget." He looked at Duke, who gazed back with unwavering loyalty. "And I won't? Not as long as I'm breathing." James lowered himself onto an old wooden crate tucked into the corner of the underground chamber, the flashlight resting on his knee as its beam painted shifting patterns across the dirt walls. The trunk sat open before him, its contents spread carefully at his feet like pieces of a puzzle he had once known, but long forgotten. Duke settled at his side, the German shepherd's head heavy on his master's knee, his warm breath a comfort in the cool air of the hideout. In James's trembling hands lay a single faded photograph. Its edges had curled with age, and a crease ran diagonally across it, but the image was still clear enough to stir his heart. He stared at the group of soldiers frozen in time, their uniforms dusty, their faces weary yet filled with the bravado of youth. And there, among them, was his younger self. Strong jaw, bright eyes, no beard yet to soften his features. A boy trying to look like a man. James's breath grew shallow as memories pressed hard against him. He remembered the smell of campfires mixed with gunpowder, the sound of boots squelching through mud, the way laughter erupted even in the darkest nights because sometimes humor was the only shield they had left. He traced each face in the photograph with a finger, whispering their names under his breath. Some were gone within weeks of that picture being taken. Others had lasted longer, but never made it home. And why had he survived when so many did not? The tears came quietly at first, then with more force, streaking down the lines of his weathered face. He did not try to hide them. For years he had locked them away, told himself that grief had no place in the quiet life he tried to build. But down here, in this hidden room carved into the earth, the past refused to stay buried. His scar burned faintly, a reminder of battles fought and wounds carried, inside and out. Duke shifted, pressing closer, his head nudging the old man's hand. James let the photograph rest in his lap and stroked the dog's fur slowly, his touch both grateful and desperate. "They were just kids, Duke," he whispered hoarsely. "Full of fire, full of dreams. And now it's just me, left to remember." His voice cracked on the last word. The silence of the chamber pressed in around him, but it was not empty. To James, it was alive with echoes, voices calling out, laughter drifting through smoke, the steady hum of men marching together. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he was there again. He could feel the weight of a rifle in his hands, hear the distant thunder of artillery, smell the sharp tang of fear in the air. He was young again, but he was also old, both lives colliding in this single moment. When he opened his eyes, the photograph blurred with tears. He held it close to his chest, rocking slightly on the crate, the motion almost like prayer. "I don't know why I was spared," he murmured, his voice low but steady now. "But I'll carry your memory until my last breath." Duke licked his hand gently, a gesture of wordless comfort. James gave a faint, broken smile. He leaned back against the dirt wall, closing his eyes as the flashlight's beam dipped toward the floor. In that moment, the old veteran was no longer alone in the chamber. He was surrounded by his brothers, their presence stitched into the very air. And though sorrow weighed heavy, there was also a quiet sense of gratitude, that he had found this place, that he had been given the chance to remember. The photograph trembled in James's hand, its faded image pulling him backward through time, until the walls of the underground chamber dissolved into memory. The cool air of the hideout gave way to the stifling heat of a foreign jungle, the musty scent of dust replaced by the sharp tang of gunpowder and sweat. He was no longer an old man sitting on a crate. He was 20 again, his uniform stiff with mud, his rifle heavy in his hands, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and duty. The young James stood tall in his memory, shoulders squared though his eyes betrayed the boy he still was. His face, unlined and strong, bore only the faintest trace of the scar that would one day carve deep across his cheek. His hands were steady, even when everything around him was chaos. He remembered how the weight of his helmet pressed down, how the strap cut into his chin, how every breath carried the metallic bite of fear. Around him, his brothers in arms moved with weary determination. Men barely older than boys, faces smudged with dirt, boots soaked through. They carried laughter in their pockets like secret weapons, jokes whispered in the dark to push back against despair. James saw their faces again, the grin of his closest friend, the determined stare of the quiet one who always walked point, the nervous glance of the youngest recruit who hummed songs from home to calm his shaking hands. Each of them was alive in his memory, vibrant, real. He remembered the night this photograph had been taken, a rare pause between skirmishes, when the world seemed to hold its breath. They had gathered in a makeshift camp, the stars hidden behind smoke and cloud, the firelight casting sharp shadows across their tired features. Someone had produced a camera, a miracle in itself, and insisted they capture the moment. "For proof we were here," his friend had joked, flashing a grin. James had stood with them, arms slung around another's shoulder, trying to look older, braver, as the shutter clicked. He hadn't realized then how precious that moment would become. The sound of gunfire echoed faintly in his memory, followed by the rush of voices. The urgency of orders barked in the night. He remembered the sudden chaos, the blur of movement, the heat of battle surging against the fragile quiet they had carved out. The faces from the photo blurred with smoke and fear, some lost before dawn, others gone in the weeks that followed. James's throat tightened as he whispered their names aloud in the dark chamber, each syllable carrying both weight and reverence. His scar seemed to burn as he remembered the day it had been carved into his flesh, a firefight that had left him bleeding in the dirt, clutching the hand of a friend who would never rise again. That scar had become part of him, a permanent reminder etched on his face of the ones who could not carry their memories home. Duke shifted at his side in the present, ears twitching at the sound of his master's voice. James opened his eyes, the tunnel walls returning, the photograph still clutched against his chest. He drew in a trembling breath, torn between sorrow and gratitude. The flashback had left him shaken, but also reminded him why this discovery mattered. The trunk, the letters, the photographs. These weren't just relics. They were the voices of men who had fought, laughed, and died. They were fragments of lives that deserved to be remembered. James wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, his resolve sharpening. He whispered to the silence, to the ghosts still lingering in the corners of memory. "You're not forgotten, not while I still breathe." The visions of the past slowly faded, and James found himself once more in the dim chamber beneath his barn. The walls of packed earth pressed close, the wooden beams groaning faintly as if the very ground remembered the weight of the years. His hand still clutched the photograph, now damp with his tears, but his gaze shifted back to the open trunk. There was more to uncover. With deliberate care, he set the photo aside and reached deeper into the trunk. His fingers brushed against cloth, stiff with age, yet unmistakably familiar. He pulled it free, and as the folds unrolled, the beam of his flashlight fell across the fabric of an American flag. Its colors were faded, the red dulled to rust, the white yellowed by time, but the stars still shone faintly, each one stitched with the same care as when it was first made. James's breath caught in his chest. The flag wasn't just cloth. It was memory, sacrifice, pride, and grief woven into one. He held it reverently, his scarred cheek illuminated by the flashlight's glow. The silence of the chamber deepened, as though the very earth bowed in respect. Duke leaned closer, sniffing the fabric with curiosity before sitting back, his eyes soft, almost knowing. James draped the flag gently over his lap, his rough hands smoothing its wrinkles. His eyes watered again, though now the tears were not only for sorrow, but also for honor. He remembered the times he had seen flags folded and handed to grieving families. He remembered the weight of silence at military funerals, the sound of rifles fired in farewell, the lone bugle calling into the air. His voice cracked as he whispered, "This flag, it meant something to them, and it still means something now." He closed his eyes, clutching it tightly, his heart pounding with both grief and gratitude. The chamber seemed warmer, as though the presence of the flag had filled it with a different kind of light. A reminder of what was worth fighting for, what was worth remembering. For a long while, James said nothing, only sat there in the dim light, with the flag across his knees and Duke's head resting against his side. The old veteran's back was straight, his posture dignified despite the ache of years. He looked less like a man burdened by age and more like a soldier standing guard once again, watching over something sacred. Eventually, he folded the flag carefully, each crease deliberate, his hands steady now, despite the tremor that had plagued them earlier. He placed it on top of the trunk, resting his hand on it as though it were the shoulder of an old friend. His eyes lifted toward the ladder, where a shaft of daylight spilled faintly down, cutting into the darkness. The past and present felt joined in that moment. The letters, the medals, the photographs, the flag. All of it was a bridge between what had been and what remained. James realized he had been chosen, not by fate perhaps, but by circumstance, to carry this story forward. He had survived when others had not, and now he understood. Survival meant responsibility. Duke shifted, letting out a low sigh as if in agreement. James smiled faintly, his scar softening in the glow. He patted the dog's side and murmured, "We'll make sure they're remembered, old boy. Every single one." With that, He rose slowly to his feet, the folded flag cradled carefully in his hands. His joints protested, but his spirit felt lighter, steadier. The chamber, once heavy with silence, now felt like a sanctuary. The story it held had been uncovered, and though grief still pressed on his heart, so too did pride. James stood quietly in the dim chamber, the folded American flag still cradled in his arms. The flashlight beam trembled faintly in his grip, casting long, wavering shadows across the dirt walls. For a moment, he simply breathed, slow, steady, letting the cool underground air fill his lungs. Duke sat close by, ears perked, golden brown eyes fixed on his master. The dog seemed to sense the weight of the moment, as if he too understood that what had been uncovered was not just history, but something sacred. Gently, James laid the flag back inside the trunk, resting it on top of the letters, medals, and photographs. His hands lingered on the cloth, pressing down softly as though sealing in not only objects, but also memories, voices, and promises. He whispered, almost like a prayer, "Rest easy, boys. You're safe here." His scarred cheek glistened with the faint trace of tears as he lowered the trunk lid. The hinges creaked, then groaned shut, the sound echoing in the chamber like the closing of a chapter. For a long while, James rested both hands on the lid, head bowed. His wiry shoulders shook once, but he steadied himself, breathing deeply. He had carried grief long enough. Now, what he felt was something closer to peace. Duke shifted, stepping forward to sniff the trunk before giving a single soft bark, as if to echo his master's farewell. James chuckled faintly through the heaviness. "Yeah, you know it too, don't you? Some things ain't meant to be forgotten." Straightening his back, James slid the trunk carefully into a corner of the chamber. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a man laying a stone into place in a monument. Dust stirred, filling the air with the earthy scent of time, but the trunk fit snugly, as though it had always belonged there. He brushed the dirt from his hands and let out a long sigh. When he turned toward the ladder, the shaft of daylight seemed brighter than before, cutting into the gloom like a promise. He raised the flashlight once more, sweeping it across the chamber for the last time. Every corner, every beam, every shadow now carried meaning. What had once been hidden in silence was now a story alive in his heart. He pressed his palm against the cool earth wall and whispered, "Thank you." Perhaps to the men he had lost, perhaps to the friend whose initials marked the trunk, perhaps even to the mysterious hand of fate that had guided Duke to scratch that floorboard. Whatever it was, gratitude filled his chest, pushing back the heaviness of sorrow. Duke nudged him gently, impatient to return to the light above. James smiled and gave the dog a scratch behind the ears. "All right, boy, let's go back. We've done what we came for." He climbed the ladder slowly, his boots pressing against each rung, the wood creaking in rhythm with his movements. The sunlight grew stronger as he rose, warm against his weathered face. His scar caught the glow, no longer a mark of pain, but a badge of endurance. When he pulled himself up into the barn, Duke bounded after him, tail wagging as though the weight of the world had lifted. James stood for a long time, staring at the open hole in the floor. He could feel the cool air still rising from it, carrying whispers of the past. With a firm nod, he set his jaw and began pulling the boards back into place, fitting them tightly one by one. The crowbar clinked softly against the wood as he hammered the planks secure. By the time he finished, the floor looked almost as it had before, ordinary, worn, unremarkable. Yet James knew better. He brushed the dust from his hands, leaned on the crowbar, and looked around the barn. It was quiet again, just the creak of wood and the sigh of wind outside. But for him, nothing would ever be quite the same. The secret was sealed, but not forgotten. The barn was quiet again, its old timbers groaning gently as the wind whispered through the cracks. Dust motes drifted in golden beams of sunlight, settling slowly across the boards James had just resealed. The floor looked unchanged, as though nothing unusual had ever happened there. But James knew better. Beneath those worn planks lay a hidden world, a chamber of voices and memories that had waited decades for someone to listen. And now, someone had. He leaned on the crowbar, his body weary yet strangely lighter than it had felt in years. The scar on his cheek no longer seemed like a mark of burden, but instead a reminder, a thread tying him to the men he had lost and to the secrets he had just uncovered. Duke padded up beside him, tail wagging lazily, his loyal eyes fixed on his master's face. The dog let out a contented sigh and lay down at James's boots, as though even he knew that the weight of sorrow had been eased. James pulled a chair closer to the hole, sitting heavily as he let his gaze wander across the barn. His mind drifted back to the letters, the medals, the faded photographs, and the folded flag. Those things had been hidden, protected, preserved in silence. And though he had sealed the floor once again, he carried their stories now in his heart. That was the true reason they had endured, so that someone would remember, someone would tell. He spoke softly, his voice echoing in the still air. "You boys aren't forgotten, not while I'm still breathing." The words weren't meant for Duke, though the dog lifted his head at the sound. They were meant for the ghosts, for the brothers who had stood beside him in mud and fire, for the friend whose initials carved into wood had waited all these years to be found. For the first time in decades, James felt at peace. The bitterness of survival, the heavy question of why me and not them, didn't gnaw at him the same way. The answer was clearer now. He had survived so that he could carry the memory, so that he could be the keeper of the stories buried in dust and earth. It wasn't a burden anymore. It was a duty, and one he would honor. Duke rose and nudged his hand, pulling him back to the present. James smiled faintly, scratching the dog's ears. "Come on, boy," he said, pushing himself slowly to his feet. His joints protested, but he ignored them. "Let's get some fresh air." Together, they stepped out of the barn into the afternoon light. The fields stretched wide and golden, the sky a canvas of endless blue. The world above ground seemed brighter, more alive, as though the past and present had finally found a way to meet. James stood tall, his back straight despite his age, his scar catching the sun. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the scent of earth and grass, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly whole. He glanced back once at the barn, its weathered boards standing silently against the horizon. A faint smile touched his lips. The secret would stay safe there, sealed but never lost, for he carried it within him now. One day, when his time came, perhaps someone else would find it, or perhaps it was enough that he had. As Duke trotted ahead, ears bouncing, James followed with steady steps. The old soldier, the scarred veteran, the keeper of memories, walked into the sunlight, not with sorrow, but with a heart full of remembrance and gratitude.